You're tuning in to the KQTH News Network radio show, Lessons in History, with your host, Jack Lansing Picton, reporting live from the International Studio Department in Athens, Greece. Show starts right now. Thanks for tuning in to today's show. As always, I'm your host, Jack Picton. Today we have the privilege to be reporting from Athens, a location that is rich in culture, architecture, and people. Of course, it would be shameful to disregard the importance of Greek mythology and the foundations for global society and politics, both of which can be attributed to the works of early Greek scholars and writers. Typically, as many of our viewers know, our focus here in Lessons of History is to discuss the contents of ancient societies and how they may have impacted the creation of modern society. However, today is a special occasion as we will be specifically dedicating our time to studying the impact that ancient Greek mythology, specifically the worship of the gods and the goddesses, had on the formation of Greek society and politics. Common knowledge has it that much of our own American political and governmental systems took notes from these ancient predecessors. However, it is imperative that we dive into how these predecessors themselves were impacted and persuaded in the ways of democracy and societal behaviors. In addition, we will also be having a special guest join us after our commercial break here today to discuss her own knowledge on the topic of discussion. A quick message from our sponsor before we begin. Zeus Hair Products. Struggling to keep that beard tamed and your women interested? Try one of our new hair products that will be sure to strike a bolt of energy into both your hair care and dating life. Again, that's Zeus Hair Products. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, back to the question today. The question today that I pose for you listeners at home is as follows. How did the gods of Olympus help shape the construct of ancient Greek society and politics? And what was the impact of governmental powers and the heads of governments as they related to the prophetical nature of the gods? Now that sounds like a handful, so I'll break it down for you. There's two sections in this question that I'm posing. The first being, obviously, the impact specifically of the gods in the formation of strictly society and politics. And the second is that how the heads of the government and how people behaved around one another as it relates to the prophecies or the justification of law by the gods of Olympus. I'll begin by helping you all understand the foundations of these assertions. The polis, or P-O-L-I-S, was understood as the foundation of human civilization. This attributes the notion for human fulfillment that could be saw in an era that is evocative of the precursor for democracy. People of ancient Greece understood the city, or in our case where we are today, Athens, as the basis for the common good and what could merit adequate behavior. As alluded to by the Socratic processes of Socrates, political theorizing began in arguments about what politics was good for, who could participate in politics, and why. Arguments would be tools in civic battles for ideological and material control, and as well as attempt to provide logical framework for these individual decisive enclosures. Often did these city-states encounter conflict between one another, especially when it came to citizenship and becoming an alien. However, what became a grueling part of this process was the necessity for justice, which was often derived from the minds of poets, philosophers, and those individuals assuming the positions of law. These, of course, were often supported by the people, many of whom had a say in position appointments. Many of the assertions that we discuss today can be traced back to the works of Socrates, a man who garnered much of his knowledge from the impact of his predecessor and teacher, Plato's. Socrates spent much of his life attempting to define political individualism and become a quote-unquote expertise in the field of politics and society. His interest in ethics quickly transitioned him into the world of political and governmental philosophy. Now, as we dive into the function of mythology in these ancient societies, I also must note the work of my dear friend Dr. Reynolds over at the prestigious Eastern Tennessee State University. As she so eloquently puts it, mythology served and continues to serve many functions in the Greek world, but not every myth serves a function. In addition, it's hard to allocate a direct function for only one myth, as many myths had multiple societal and religious functions. One great example that often comes to mind is the story of the Minotaur, one that I like to rely upon for many of my bases for a governmental and philosophical revision. This story relating the Minotaur relates the importance for keeping one's promise. The story, of course, alludes to the broken promise of Minos to the gods, and in result, the birth of the hellish spawn of a half-man, half-beast Minotaur. Often, the stories of the gods relate kind of information regarding the punishments, resulting in the failure to follow orders or directions or the maltreatment of others. Thus, democratic processes, or at least their preceding foundations, were often based on these myths discussing punishment. Of course, none of these actions came to fruition. However, they did send a signal to the people, especially a people that worshipped the gods so heavily, into following a strict and moral code. We're about to head to our first commercial break, but when we return, we will have the delight to welcome guest Professor Bryn, an individual with immense knowledge of the ancient world, in exploring this topic of ancient Greek politics and society. Stay tuned. Joining us live back here is Professor Bryn, the professor of Roman Greek literature and mythology at Yale University. How are you doing, Professor?
Outstanding. Thank you so much for having me.
It is a pleasure to have you here on our show, The Lessons in History. As you know, here on Lessons of History, we dedicate much of our time to studying the ancient world, and specifically today, how mythology played a role in the formation of government and politics. It's always a treat to have an individual with an immense amount of knowledge and background information on a topic that is so meaningful to not only our own country and the country of Greece, but also of the whole world and the formation of basically the society that we live in today.
Yeah.
So obviously we do have some questions for you, and we just want to pick your brain a little bit while we have our listeners here at home. Hopefully can learn a thing or two from this conversation. So you and I both understand the implications for such a basis. My question for you is, how did the gods affect the formation of such city-states like Athens, in which we currently are situated in, and specifically, how was the belief in such mythology a driving factor in societal and political life in ancient Greece and Rome?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for building me up. And I think this is a really fascinating topic to discuss because, like you said, it has so many ramifications. Like you see, our current Western politics derived from Roman culture even to this day. And it is such a broad, overarching category. I think I could just go on for hours talking about it. So cut me off whenever you need to. But I'm going to be making a few disclaimers as I speak today. And I think the first is a lot of amateur scholars will ask the question, Greek versus Roman, what's the difference in terms of society, politics, things of that nature, mythology? And I think there are two main ideas you need to keep in mind, and that is that Greek and Roman culture and society are very similar because their languages overlap. We see the Latin alphabet almost directly derived from the Greek alphabet, and so that affects a lot of the ways different messages are conveyed with certain words, certain letters. And quite honestly, they have almost the identical set of gods. The only difference is the certain names they use for gods. So we see Zeus changed to Jupiter, we see Hera, his wife and relative, changed to Juno when we're going from Greek to Roman. So just keep that in mind when I'm talking about Roman, you can relate that back to Greek mythology.
Certainly, absolutely. And you mentioned the disclaimer. Of course, there is a very important connection between Greek and Roman histories, and I think part of our discussion during this fall with my listeners is that although we are strictly focusing on Greek mythology and the impact that that has had, that's not to say that the Romans certainly didn't have as much, if not a greater impact on our current situation in the world today. And, we can certainly derive a lot of things from Roman interactions and the transition from Greek to that Roman period in time. And obviously the similarities are overwhelming. But without further ado, I'll let you go ahead and continue with what we were mentioning before.
Right, thank you. And so for the sake of ease, today I'm going to be addressing Roman culture and using the Roman terms for certain identities. And now, second disclaimer, the most important notion of the polytheistic Roman religion I think you need to keep in mind is that these gods and goddesses we're talking about, they're not just a bunch of white dudes sitting on clouds giving orders. We don't see the Roman Senate develop because Jupiter said there had to be 100 people who came together, or two consuls because Mercury delivered this message. These gods are depicted as humanoid creatures who think, who desire, who hurt, and who scheme like humans. In both statue art and literary art, we really see them depicted as humans. And so, in that nature, they are supposed to embody certain customs of Roman culture. And so, what I mean by that is the way we see the gods acting in mythology and their interactions with humans, that's supposed to embody how the Romans were supposed to interact. And it normalizes certain interactions. Like we see adultery so prevalent amongst the gods. And that just goes to show how adultery wasn't seen as this huge evil in Roman culture. And not to say it was encouraged, but it certainly wasn't as weird as you would think it to be in
Absolutely.
current times.
And earlier in the show today, we were talking about the story of the Minotaur with Minos and how his actions related with the gods and his lack of fulfillment of a promise led to not adultery necessarily, but the forced seduction of his wife to an animal, which in turn turned into the creation of the Minotaur. So I think that there are certainly a lot of human aspects of the gods which had a tremendous impact on why the creation of such city-states or governments were so focused on the human nature and the process of treating one another properly and fairly, and that's how you get the intrinsic democratic values from Greek and sometimes even Roman culture as well. So just thought I would touch on that as well.
Right, and I think later I'm going to talk about this Roman author Tacitus, and he really explains the whole history of the Roman Empire and how there are these different mythologies to explain certain events, and how humans didn't necessarily believe in these gods as real figures who were giving them orders, but it was the spirit of these gods and how these stories could help explain the certain ideals that they had in their culture. So I think this is where mythology really ties to society and politics. We have these stories involving the gods, and these set the standards for Roman living. Now, I want to go into a specific topic that is very prevalent amongst the Romans, and that is their military. Now, there's a reason the Roman Empire was the largest empire territorially at its time, and to this day it remains one of the largest territories just by space alone. And now when you think of ancient Roman works, what is the topic that really comes to mind when you're envisioning Homer and Virgil? It's going to be military conquest and the acquisition of territory. Now, we see a talk of fighting and battle. It's so prevalent within these ancient Roman works, but at the same time, it wasn't chaotic. It wasn't random. There are set customs for battle. There's a set way to retrieve dead bodies. There's a set way to challenge someone to a one-on-one duel. Now, let's examine the case of Gaius Julius Caesar. So this is a Roman general who self-declares himself dictator of Rome. And eventually, this leads to his demise. He is stabbed to death, we all know, by a bunch of Roman senators. And one of the main grievances they have with him is his disobedience towards set customs of Roman battle. And what he specifically does is he brings his army into the city of Rome, which is a big no-no. But why is this a big no-no? Well, I think we can really look back to the mythological origin story of Rome. So this is where we get into the mythology, and this is going to play into politics and how different politicians are going to enact legislature for either condoning or trying to minimize the military. So, and like I talked about earlier with this author Tacitus, he talks about, there could be different ways people want to explain the origin of Rome. If we look at historical records, it was really most probable that the Romans were derived from the people, the Etruscans. But there is this overarching story of Romulus and Remus and how they founded Rome, and a lot of Romans, and to this day, Roman scholars, look to that. So let's break down that story a little bit. We have two brothers, two twins, Romulus, Remus. When they are young, their uncle attempts to kill them. He's unsuccessful. They are raised by a she-wolf. They grow into adulthood, at which point they decide to establish their own city. And now, as I'm sure any twin can testify to, they don't get along that well. And one of the main issues they have when discussing this new city is where to build it. Sees 12 birds. He sees 12 birds on a hill, says, "That is the gods. They are talking to me. We need to build this new city on this hill." Fast forward a little bit, Romulus now sees 6 birds on a different hill, on the Palatine Hill, which, if you know, that's one of the hills in Rome. And they have this disagreement, which portent is more important, which hill is it going to be? And Remus's argument is, I saw 6 birds, but I saw them first, so that means they're more important. Then Romulus says, no, I saw 12 birds. There were more of them, even though I saw them after you. That makes it more important. And the final straw that broke the camel's back is when Romulus begins to build the city on his hill, on the Palatine Hill. And we see Remus disgrace him by almost mocking him and stepping over this wall, this border that Romulus is building. And, like Cain and Abel, you can make that connection to the Bible. He kills his own brother. He kills his own blood, his twin. And so we relate that back to Gaius Julius Caesar. Gaius Julius Caesar breaks one of the biggest commandments of Roman culture. You do not bring hostility, you do not bring hate into a city's border. So I think that's just one example of a mythological story where, whether Romans want to believe it in its truth or not, it's still a great demonstrator of the customs that are important to the Romans. And specifically in this context, we're talking about the Roman military.
And sorry to interrupt you, but
please.
I was just making a connection, and I think it's demonstrative of the connection between ancient Rome and ancient Greek. And as we see here in Athens, we think about what was present, hundreds of thousands of years ago, and that the Athenian government and Athenian construction of the state was based on, the mythology behind Poseidon and Athena, and the fact that the people chose the Athenian route, and now that they have the mythological connection to the olive tree, which is present in the state of Athens, and that's obviously not exactly word for word connected to the Roman literature and mythology, but there are certainly precedents being set between the two that connect, the language barrier, and you could go on and on and on, as you mentioned, but it's just so interesting to hear about how the people, especially democratic people, or mostly democratic people, were able to contrive and retract information from these myths or from these legends and turn them into the basis for the construction of their city or their or the people and the culture and everything. So that most certainly only benefits our topic, which would be discussing the impact that the gods and the goddesses had on the societal and political life in both ancient Greece and in Rome. So.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting when you look at the power dynamic between all of the various gods. There's just eternal struggle. They are always competing. There's always strife. There's always one person trying to out the other. But then there's also this Roman ideal of fate, and that fate is unavoidable. And there's this undercurrent of fairness in really pretty much all the gods do. If you do this negative thing, there will be a negative impact from the gods. If you make a proper sacrifice and take it up to the temple, you will be favored. And so I think that really just goes and carries into the politics of the time, where if you do what Gaius Julius Caesar did, if you break the code, then you'll get stabbed 27 times.
And much like Minos broke the code of his promise to the gods, and in turn his wife was seduced by a beast, just stories and everything adds up, and it is just mind-boggling. And even though I'm a radio show host who has been doing this for a long period of time, discussing ideas and topics of the ancient world, it just never ceases to amaze me, the depth and amount of information that we can recall and discuss even thousands of years later about the context of the world. So once again, Professor Bryn from Yale University, thank you very much for coming on to the show today. We appreciate your time, and we hope the viewers at home, everyone had a meaningful experience in terms of listening about the foundations of Greek politics and society, and then learning about an interesting perspective about how that had an impact on Roman society. And that'll wrap up about today's episode from Lessons in History. I'm your host, Jack Picton, signing out from KQTH News Network.